Our guest today is one of the leading civil rights lawyers in the country and our compatriot Armen Merjan. Welcome to the show, Armen.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Congratulations. First and foremost, congratulations on a Lifetime Achievement Award. Please tell us what this award means to you.
Well, it means I'm getting old, first of all.
And aren't we all? Aren't we all?
I know, but I thought I was too young for this. But no, it's a lovely recognition of the work. And, you know, the New York Law Journal generally gives these awards to the big time corporate attorneys, right? So it's nice to see the civil rights work being recognized. So it's a lovely honor.
I want to read something from the press release that was published on law.com, and I'm quoting. Mr. Merjan is likely the preeminent lawyer in a history of HIV/AIDS epidemic, with New York at its epicenter. I would like to ask you to take us back in time. This is, I'm assuming, it's late 80s, early 90s. Is that correct time frame?
That's when I parachuted in, yes. I mean, okay. HIV was first diagnosed in 1981, in fact, but legal struggles took some time, as I can explain. So you are correct with my time frame.
Okay. Give us some sense of legal landscape.
No one knew what it was. They only knew that it was deadly. And ultimately, we learned that it was transmitted sexually or through sharing of needles. But like every new illness and disease that comes along, it brought with it unbelievable discrimination, unbelievable prejudice, unbelievable stigma, and unbelievable ignorance about means of transmission and what it meant. Survey after survey showed people afraid to use water fountains, afraid to be in the same workspace, afraid to be in the pool. And none of those things is in any way a threat. You cannot contract HIV through any of those methods, but people were just so terrified and ignorant. And it's what we see over and over again when there are new illnesses or new categories of folks who are being discriminated against. You see widespread prejudices. So the landscape was terrible. And we had a president in Ronald Reagan who, in the midst of this horror, he refused to even mention the words HIV/AIDS. He did nothing while so many people were dying. And of course, it was hitting communities that were already laboring under prejudices, right? The LGBTQ communities, Haitians early on, and Black and Latino people on, IV drug users. And so it meant that it was, to use the word during the Third Reich, the Untermenschen, the lower class people. It was the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, right? It was the lower rung of people in the society. And so not only did Reagan refuse to even utter the words HIV and AIDS, much less do something to help combat both the prejudice and the illness medically, but the Supreme Court refused to take any cases until 17 years later. So while we saw people having their rights violated over and over again, the High Court of America, which should have been stepping in to take cases, they wouldn't even take a case until 98, refused or failed to do anything to help people. And so we saw these struggles at the state and local level, Hike, because the Supreme Court and the federal government were doing nothing to help these communities.
And, you know, I definitely want to come back to Ottoman Empire and Armenians for sure later in our conversation, and to Supreme Court for that matter of fact as well. But I was reading the cases that you fought and won. And I wanted to ask you to give us an example for members of our audience who are not lawyers, like myself, of a specific case that you think had a major significance in terms of this movement.
Sure. So in the early 2000s, in 2005, to take one a little later in the day, frankly, in my career, the Republican governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour, decided that he was going to really radically change Medicaid. Medicaid is the federal program that allows people who are categorically indigent to get both medical services and the prescription drugs. Mississippi is the poorest state in America. Out of 50 states, Mississippi ranks last in just about everything. Definitely first in poverty, last in the health care it gives to people and so forth. In fact, people in Mississippi are so poor that more than 1 out of 4 Mississippians, 26%, are so indigent that they rely on Medicaid to stay alive and get medical treatment. Well, one of the things you get in Medicaid is prescription drugs. Haley Barbour decided that he was going to place a cap on the prescription drugs that people in Mississippi could get to no more than 5 drugs a month, only 2 of which could be brand name. Now, that was a death sentence, both more generally for people in Mississippi and for people living with HIV. Why? At the time, there were almost no generic drugs for HIV and AIDS. What we call an HIV cocktail, and that's not to diminish how important it is, or the medical regimen that folks followed, it was a minimum of 3 brand name drugs. By capping the brand name drugs available to people at 2 rather than 3, all of the breakthroughs in treating HIV would be gone and people would die once again as they did early on in the illness. Here's another just lovely part of this story, is that in Mississippi, the Medicaid federal program, for every dollar spent, the federal program gives Mississippi 77 cents on the dollar, and Mississippi pays 23 cents. So in fact, Medicaid is a revenue generator for Mississippi. They are actually making money by providing health care.
And keeping people healthy.
And keeping people healthy and
great
alive.
Investment in its own right.
Absolutely. And so this was not only penny wise and pound foolish, but just cruel and draconian. And so we joined a national coalition to sue Mississippi and say, this doesn't make any sense.
And Armen, where are we now in terms of civil rights protection with for individuals infected with HIV/AIDS today?
Sure. And in our community, we use the expression people living with HIV because
I stand corrected.
And perfectly fair. Folks don't always know the terminology, but it recognizes that they have many aspects of their life and they're merely living with it. They're not infected people any more than all of us who might have a illness at a particular time. Where we are is we have great protections on the books, but as you know, the protections on the books, the laws are only as good as the enforcement, right? And so we still have tremendous struggles. We have just filed a lawsuit in upstate New York against a state university that conducted a horrible case of discrimination against our client. Our client is a person living with HIV who had a wonderful scholarship to go to school, low income. This was a wonderful opportunity, had enrolled at 18 years of age in summer classes and had a great grade point average and was ready to go freshman year. Got involved with another student. Our client happened to be living with HIV, but our client was undetectable. And for folks who don't know, the huge change in HIV treatment and in the terrain of HIV that will allow us, we think, ultimately to eliminate HIV is not the cure for HIV, which we still don't have, but drugs that allow people to have HIV be rendered undetectable in their bloodstream. It means that when the virus cannot be detected in their bloodstream, they cannot transmit the virus at all. It's as if it were cured for those purposes. And we call that U equals U. Undetectable equals untransmissible. And it's a wonderful thing because bringing people into medical treatment, like Mississippi always should, as you say, not only keeping them well, but actually as a preventative measure, makes them incapable of passing on the illness, which is how we stop it. Well, this individual was undetectable and for quite a sustained period of time, meaning that she was in control of her health and of her HIV and was no threat to anyone. When the university learned that she was living with HIV, they kicked her out of her dorm, suspended her from school, escorted her, the police, to a bus station, rendering her homeless, and ultimately kicked her out of school, deeming her a threat to the campus, which, again, like the early days of wondering whether going to a water fountain after a person living with HIV can be a threat, is based on prejudice and stigma and ignorance. She was no threat to anyone. And of course, she had a greater command of her health and was in control of it to make sure she wasn't a threat more than people who didn't know their status or could have sexually transmissible diseases, as we know on campus happens all the time, and hadn't tested for them. So she was no threat, and her entire life was derailed, and she was rendered homeless based on what we call antediluvian, before the floods, right? Very old notions of how HIV is transmitted, and it ruined her entire career.
Supreme Court today, of course, moved significantly to the right. And what I'm interested in, is there any current or pending Supreme Court cases that are affecting your work today?
Well, there's been lots of cases that are pending. First, we have to step back and say that a lot of folks don't look at the judiciary as important as it is, right? It does everything to tell us what our rights are and are not. And people aren't watching that. But the right, the ultra-conservatives in this country for decades have had a campaign to fundamentally rewrite all of the laws and to redo the judiciary. And the presidents are the ones that make the appointments on the federal side to stack the courts in their favor, as they have now done with the Supreme 6-3. You know, Martin Luther King used to say that the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards justice, right? The arc of the universe, rather, is long, but it bends towards justice. But in fact, it doesn't bend. We have to bend it to justice or it won't bend. And a perfect example is Roe versus Wade, a woman's right to choose. 50 years ago, 51 now, in 73, the Supreme Court said a woman has a right to choose and to control. The strong majority of Americans, regardless of what your background is, you have to acknowledge that the vast majority of Americans, sometimes a very, I should say, strong majority, but always a majority, favors that. And yet a half century later, instead of the arc of the universe bending towards justice, a stacked Supreme Court that the right had done everything to stack against basic rights of women, of people of color, of minorities, of the disabled, came down and rendered a decision that undid a constitutional right that had lasted a half century. So everything affects me. Who wins the next election affects me, because we need to put people on the courts who understand what it's like to be poor, to be unhoused, to be transgender, to be discriminated against, and to enforce those laws. And unfortunately, we have all too many jurists, judges in this country, who don't understand those things. Of course, we have too many people in general who don't understand those things. And as an Armenian, I remind people every day that we have to be keenly aware of and sensitive to these things, because we, above most people in the history of the world, have an unbelievable history of oppression that dates back so many years. You know, I joke with my friends that we have the honor or dishonor of having been conquered by just about everyone who ever conquered anyone, because Armenia was on the Silk Road, was in the crossroads. And so you name a civilization, and I will name a civilization that marched through Armenia and killed us. So we have to be incredibly sensitive to how you can be disenfranchised, and you can be marginalized, and you can be discriminated against, and what you need to do to help others in those same situations.
You know, I will remiss to mention that, unfortunately, what you described in terms of Armenia being conquered and Armenian people being killed, unfortunately, it is not a thing of a past or a history.
Of course.
Most recently, we saw horrific ethnic cleansing at the minimum of population of Artsakh. We saw 130,000 people, families, children, women, elderly, in cars, in trucks, on foot, leaving their ancestral land. Truly horrific, horrific images that I think are going to stay with us for generations. When I was, again, preparing for this interview, I've read something that was quite moving. Clearly, the field of law that you have chosen is not the most lucrative one. I think that's pretty obvious to anyone, whether you understand the legal landscape or not. But the connection was made that you have chosen this field because you're Armenian, because you came from a generation of people that have been oppressed and killed and enslaved. Let's talk about your heritage. Let's talk about how did it determine your profession, and let's talk about the strength and determination, because I'm assuming everything you described so easily is actually tremendously difficult. There are roadblocks every single way, from budgetary to legal and so forth and political. What does being Armenian means to you in terms of your profession?
Sure. So first, I come from horribly oppressed victims of genocide on all four of my grandparents. On my maternal side, my maternal grandfather from Malatya actually fled the Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1896. Again, people focus on the genocide as they should in so many ways, but we have to understand that the Armenians for hundreds of years were subjected to horrible discrimination under the Ottoman Empire, and there were frequent bouts of ethnic cleansing or quasi-genocide. And one of them was under Sultan Abdul Hamid in 1894 to 1896. My grandfather was rendered an orphan as a result of that. He didn't even know what his birthday was. He picked May 1st, and we always wondered why his birthday was May 1st, and it was in solidarity with the workers of the world as a poor worker himself. But it was an artificial date because he had no idea, because he was a child when he was rendered an orphan. My maternal grandmother was also marched into the desert to die. She was sold into slavery like many Armenian girls were. She watched her parents marched into the desert. She buried her mother in the desert. She told me and spoke of it infrequently, as many victims do, survivors do, a harrowing tale of listening as dogs unburied her mother the night that they buried her, because of course they had no implements to truly bury her, and they had to listen to their mother consumed on the death march to Syria. And I will, again, bummer, but we're Armenian. This is what we deal in and talk about. On the paternal side, my grandfather was rendered an orphan as well. His mother actually made it with him to Haleb, Syria, and only for her to have contracted cholera like so many people on the march did. And he had the misfortune of watching his mother thrown on a cart, still alive and buried under the bodies of cholera victims to be taken and put into a mass grave. And my paternal grandmother from Urfa was also marched into the desert, rendered a orphan, and sold into slavery. And what many people don't know is that she was also branded like a barnyard animal by her enslavers on her face, her chin, her chest, and her arms. And some of my earliest memories, because I was raised with my grandparents, were of seeing my grandmothers and my paternal grandmother, for example, and wondering what it was that was on her face and chin, and what were these strange symbols. And they were the symbols of slavery. So I would ask any Armenian who is in touch with this history and understands what happens, how you cannot be moved to do something about it. You know, Winston Churchill is said to have said, "Let the Armenians starve," and did nothing. The United States did nothing to intervene. The world was sick of war at the end of World War I and did nothing to protect an Armenian homeland. The treaties that had been put in place were quickly undone, I should say. And Ataturk said, we're not going to be chastened by this. We're not going to lose territory. Turkey was the only major player that, while the Ottoman Empire went down, Turkey didn't lose its land. It gained its land or preserved it because no one had the stomach to protect the Armenians, and no one did anything in the face of this injustice. So my entire life, I have burned with a passion to fight injustice and fight for justice for anyone who is a modern day Armenian.
Civil rights attorney Armen Merjan, thank you so much for this interview.
Pleasure, and best to everyone. Achkit Luis. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.